As U.S. military planners increasingly prepare for a major clash with China over Taiwan, the odds often look quite grim for the United States. Wargame after wargame has shown the U.S. military either losing outright or eking out a costly victory in order to turn back a Chinese attempt on Taiwan. One of the best-case scenarios in a 2022 study projected the United States could win at a cost of up to 2 aircraft carriers, 20 other warships, 400 warplanes, and around 3,000 troops in just 3 weeks of fighting. With these troubling war games in mind, some U.S. strategists have looked for new ways to defeat a Chinese invasion fleet without losing so many U.S. assets and personnel. Rather than a mutually costly fight for both American and Chinese forces, U.S. war planners have instead envisioned subjecting Chinese forces to a gruesome fight against a constant buzzing swarm of cheap but deadly drones. They're calling it the unmanned Hellscape strategy. Since normalizing ties with China in the 1970s, U.S. policy toward Taiwan has been described as one of, quote, strategic ambiguity, unquote. The United States treats its contacts with the de facto Taiwanese government as informal interactions and continues to supply the island with weapons it could potentially use to resist a Chinese invasion. Still, the United States leaves unclear whether it would sail to Taiwan's defense in a worst-case scenario. For decades, this policy of strategic ambiguity has maintained a peaceful but uneasy status quo. However, in that time, China has vastly increased the size of its military and modernized its fighting capabilities. In 2020, China officially overtook the United States as the country with the largest naval force by sheer number of vessels. U.S. military planners have concluded a major component of this Chinese force modernization is the development of what's known as the Anti-Access Area Denial, or A2AD, capability. In other words, China wants to assert control over a sphere of influence and block the United States or any other challenger from contesting their territorial claims. In a Taiwan conflict scenario, there is a real risk that China could make significant progress overwhelming the island's defenses or even capture the island outright before the United States and its allies will have mobilized enough forces to fight back. From there, it becomes a real question of whether the United States will be willing to take on the more challenging fight of counter-invading Taiwan and driving China back off the island. Even more advantageous for China is that its forces could potentially fire on approaching third-party interventionist forces from the comfort and relative logistical ease of the mainland. U.S. forces sailing to Taiwan's defenses, or liberation, would have to drive into a veritable Chinese shooting gallery. A set of 2022 war games, conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, provides some of the best publicly accessible information about how a Taiwan conflict scenario would play out. Across 24 games, CSIS found a U.S.-Taiwanese victory was often achievable, but also at a heavy price. CSIS determined there are 4 requisite conditions for a relatively successful Taiwan defense. First, Taiwan must have an indigenous force strong enough to contain any beachhead the Chinese forces might establish on their shorelines. Second, the U.S. must be all in, ready to enter a direct conflict immediately, rather than hesitating or adopting a so-called Ukraine model of supplying Taiwan from afar while staying out of the direct fighting. Third, the U.S. must be able to use its bases in Japan as a launching point for such operations. This part is critical because it will almost certainly mean Japan will also have to be a party to the fighting and will have to agree to bear the costs that would come their way as a result. Fourth, and finally, the U.S. must be able to strike at the Chinese fleet heavily and from outside of China's anti-ship and anti-aircraft shield. The emerging Hellscape strategy appears to try to get around this fourth challenge. Admiral Samuel Paparo, the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, began to articulate the Hellscape model in a June 2024 interview with the Washington Post. Speaking with the paper, the Indo-PACOM commander described a plan whereby the moment Chinese invasion forces start moving on Taiwan, the U.S. military begins deploying thousands of relatively cheap unmanned aircraft, as well as drone ships and drone submarines, to harass the Chinese invasion forces. Paparo indicated the plan would entail a range of other currently classified capabilities. The Indo-PACOM commander said, quote, "I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities so that I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me time for the rest of everything," unquote. In essence, Paparo would be willing to sacrifice a bunch of drones for a month to exhaust the Chinese military and buy the time needed to assemble the counterattack force to mount the larger defense of Taiwan. The US military is already rapidly developing the components necessary to conduct this Hellscape defense. The US has used many high-end strike drones over the years, but recent conflicts like the war in Ukraine have proven the efficacy of weaponizing much smaller and cheaper unmanned systems. Embracing this model of cheap and disposable drone weapons, the Pentagon dedicated $1 billion in the first round of a drone concept project called Replicator, which aims to develop cheap but effective and rapidly deployable air and sea drones that could swarm the Taiwan Strait to blunt a Chinese invasion. In May, the Pentagon announced it had chosen the AeroVironment Switchblade 600 as its first replicator system and had begun looking for vendors to produce unmanned surface vessels. The Switchblade 600 is a loitering munition that has already seen use in Ukraine. With a set of spring-loaded wings and a pusher prop, the Switchblade can be launched from a tube and hang around over a battlefield searching for a target. In November, then Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks announced the first batch of replicator drone systems would be ready to ship to the fighting forces by August of this year. Other systems are also moving toward delivery. The Pentagon has chosen the Anduril Dive LD as its first drone submarine. This system is primarily designed for surveillance. The Army has also chosen the Anduril Industries Ghost X drone, an autonomous operating drone helicopter for surveillance, which can be packed down into a rifle case and assembled and ready for flight in as little as 2 minutes. The second new Army drone is the Performance DroneWorks C-100, an autonomous quadcopter that can carry and then release a munition weighing up to 10 pounds. The Marines have chosen the Anduril Industries Altius 600, a tube-launched autonomous pusher-prop drone that can carry a variety of payloads including explosive ordnance, similar to the Switchblade 600. The Replicator program is also advancing the U.S. Air Force's Enterprise Test Vehicle, which seeks an autonomous system that can fly for up to 500 nautical miles at a speed of over 100 miles per hour, with the capability to carry a variety of different payloads. This system could be a fast-moving, long-range, small loitering munition. Last month, the Air Force narrowed the ETV program down to 2 finalists, the Anduril 500 Barracuda and the Zone 5 Rusty Dagger open weapon platform. Both systems are described as rapidly producible, small cruise missiles. It remains to be seen whether this replicator drone army will ever be called into action. As with any widely publicized strategy, China is aware and is likely developing its own countermeasures. A January paper by the China Land Power Study Center at the U.S. Army War College notes China is preparing a range of systems to counter drones, including laser interceptors. So, will this Hellscape drone swarm ever be needed? And should the day come, will a swarm of mass-produced drones effectively slow a Chinese invasion fleet? If you've watched this far, consider subscribing and leave a comment letting me know what you think.